Hello, dear viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So here I'm outside the offices of Private Eye, this satirical magazine found about 1962 by Richard Ingrams and others. But anyway, I'm here mainly to connect in some numinous way to my favourite writer whose lifetime overlapped with mine, and that'd be the late Christopher Hitchens, who died just over 10 years ago. Because if you see Diana the Morning After, which came out in 1998, he goes in here in this door. Private Eye's been there, I think, since its foundation. So that was the first anniversary of Princess Diana's death when that documentary came out. And he's analysing the reaction, the supposed faux grief, the mass psychosis that was consequent upon her premature demise, dying at the age of 36 in a road traffic accident in Paris. But anyway, so I go up to the door and touch it, and then I can mysteriously feel I'm in contact with him. I've never actually been in here, not I'm going to go in here now. Okay, so his hand must have touched somewhere along this door, and I've done that. Here I am touching the door handle. I've done that with, say, where Shelley carved his name into the wall in upper school, traced my right index finger through it, because his hand must have touched somewhere around here when he was carving it. So then I can know that I've touched something that he's touched as a relic of his. So Christopher Hitchens is born at Portsmouth, United Kingdom, in 1949. I don't know his actual birthday. I think it was in April. Anyway, his father was a Royal Naval officer, his mother was a housewife, those being the days when bourgeois women, if they were wed, tended not to work. You say, oh, how can you say being a homemaker is not working? But you know what I mean, work outside the house. And he was their firstborn 3 years later, when his father was stationed in Malta. He was joined by his younger brother, Peter, who is with us yet, who is an ultra-conservative journalist, or he was proud to call himself a reactionary. Anyway, Christopher Hitchens, their family moved around. They were based in North Britain for a while. His father was stationed there, though Christopher Hitchens was certainly not cut from military cloth. But for someone who'd grown up, I suppose, working class, but below middle class, this was about the best career his father could have. And he was in it, joined as soon as he could, stay till retirement age. Then was a burst in a prep school in Oxford. I don't know which one, actually. But his parents had some sort of perfunctory marriage, and they were communicants of the Church of England. And he went to various prep schools. Then he went to, let me see, I always get it confused, the Lees School in Cambridge, which is a Methodist foundation, which is seen as not quite as grand as an Anglican one. But he said the trouble about these Anglican public schools, he always went to Tunbridge, is there was some sort of alliance between the armed forces, the Church of England, and the royal family. And it was quite a stretch on the family finances for him to go there. But his mother said, if there's an upper class in this country, Christopher's going to be in it. And you were not to call him Chris, or you'd get a withering glare. So they both smoked, his parents. His father smoked a pipe. That was the era when people had little idea that tobacco was bad for them. So he was always very curious and consuming reams of newsprint, wondering in, let's say, about 1958, why it was that French paratroopers in Algiers were threatening to launch a putsch in Paris, and his father required Gallic temperament. So anyway, Christopher, he did well at the Lees. It was all boys in those days. They wouldn't give me a job at that school, thanks a lot. But it was there that he came to be a disbeliever in Christianity, and indeed all faiths. And came to identify with the Labour Party. And he was glad to see some pro-Labour bumper stickers on the cars of his teachers. So the Lees School's in Cambridge. It's not part of Cambridge University, it's a secondary school, but it was still a magnificent place for him to go to school. And then he went to Balliol College, Oxford, to read PPE, Philosophy, Politics, Economics. Went up in 1967. So revolution was in the air, as was indeed cannabis. So he's in the Labour Party, and he identified as a Trotskyist. Don't call it Trotskyite. The suffix "ite" is usually because it's pejorative. And in the summer of 1968, going to Cuba to volunteer to cut sugarcane. They wanted to see whether it's a genuine socialist state, or was it just a degenerated socialist state like the Soviet Union? Because he began to think that things had really gone wrong. The Soviet Union with Stalinism, and by the late 60s under Brezhnev, it wasn't greatly better. And he recalled being so aghast at the crushing of the Prague Spring, and that was happening in August 1968 when he flew back from Cuba. They flew on Czechoslovak Airlines, I think via Prague, a rather a circuitous route. But it's very much a 68ard, even before the term was invented. He graduated with a third-class degree. It seemed to me that much of his life was bearing his erudition rather too heavily, as though it was a desperate attempt to live down his mediocre degree class. But perhaps he was too busy starting the revolution to be a studious undergraduate. He said he had two homosexualist relationships with men who later ended up in Thatcher's cabinet. Now, he didn't name them, they're yet to be identified, but there weren't that many Oxonians in his time who went on to be in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. Now, William Waldegrave was one possibility, but he's discounted it himself. So this bit of tart gossip, well, we've never got to the bottom of it unless he's just being mischievous with us. And he came down to London. It was quite possible to live on a modest salary here very well. The population had fallen so much since the Second World War, people were even squatting. There were a lot of derelict buildings, but the place was shabby. And he was training to be a producer at the BBC. He started writing for the New Statesman and so on. So the standard left-wing publications published all his bump, and he was part of the International Socialist Trotskyist group. He was deeply disillusioned with Harold Wilson's Labour government, who he felt wasn't calling America out for its war in Indochina. Anyway, this was a time of Indomania, when bien-pensant Westerners became infatuated with all things Indian, from cuisine to meditation to yoga to Ayurvedic medicine. And his parents had split up, but for the sake of appearances, they would go to a cocktail party as a couple if they felt that was socially obligatory. But anyway, his mother had begun a liaison with a unfrocked Anglican clergyman, and he and she, they were then votaries of the Maharishi, whatever it was, the so-called perfect master, who was certainly perfect in separating fools from their money, as it was with these two. So anyway, Hitchens thought this guy was an outright con man. But anyway, Hitchens' mother and Yvonne and her paramour, they went to Greece, and they're in Athens because of folie à deux. They formed some sort of suicide pact. And that guy, he topped himself with a knife, and she took an overdose of sleeping tablets. So Hitchens was with his girlfriend when she happened to read, some British woman with the surname Hitchens has been found dead in Athens, supposedly suicide. That's a very uncommon name. I don't know anyone else with the surname Hitchens. Could this be his mother? He hadn't heard from her for a while. This is the 60s, when international phone calls were very expensive and long before mobiles. So eventually he was called to go to Athens to try and identify the corpse, and indeed it was his mother. He later discovered she had tried to call him 6 times from her hotel room. Had one of those calls got through, the sound of his voice would surely have changed her mind about ending her life. So it was a ghastly spectacle. It was a bitter blow for him, because he really adored his mother, and he read her suicide note, something that was so personal and so painful, he refused to divulge it in his autobiography, even 40 years later. His brother was considered too young to have to deal with this grisly scene, and the Greek Orthodox priest didn't want to bury a suicide in consecrated ground, but Hitchens said when he crossed the priest's palm with silver, the priesthood fell into compliance, as the priesthood usually does. So Hitchens fell back, he not believing in any afterlife, and he just threw himself into journalism. So he knew everyone who was anyone in London literary circles. Sir Salman Rushdie at that time, good friend of James Fenton. Kingsley Amis, he was a dear friend of Kingsley Amis's son, Martin Amis, and various others. But he said by the time he was 30, he was fed up with London, which is why he jetted off to the United States, which he visited several more times. So really to make his name in the United States, and he lived there the rest of his life. So he married first to a Greek Cypriot and consented to have his children baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church. That marriage later broke down. Then he wed Carol Blue, who was from a Hebraic background. He had a daughter with her. His only son's named Alexander. His daughters are named Antonia and Sophie, or is it Sophia? So you see the classical theme there. And he's author of many, many books. So he's always scabrous, frightfully farouche, a very combative journalist, and always looking for a fight. So not a man who was easy to pigeonhole. He was very consistent on being anti-religious, but he was someone who really vociferated for the liberation of Iraq in 2003. He was certainly anti-totalitarian. By the end of his life, he identified as a Marxist and a liberal, but not a socialist. He was rather indifferent to economics, which might seem curious for a socialist. Anyway, that is Christopher Hitchens, because he has no grave, he has no memorial. I know he deserves a statue. There was no funeral, so no exequies. There was no chance for a final valediction from his many admirers along the globe. There was a farewell event to him about 2 weeks before he died on television here in London, broadcast, hosted by his dear boon companion Stephen Fry, starring Sean Penn and Richard Dawkins, that professor, various others, Salman Rushdie. But Hitchens himself was dying in a Texan hospital, so was unable to make it, which is an awful pity, but did watch it live by video link. And that's as close to saying goodbye to him as we ever got. So if I can connect with him, maybe a meeting of minds, be it reading his things, you know, it's a regret I'll take to my grave with me that I never met him. And I go through London, I went past Jeremy Thorpe's house and say, my God, I walked past that house countless times when I was about 19, and I could have met him and I had no idea he lived in there, although he was stricken by Parkinson's then. Anyway, that's it. So if there's a famous person you want to meet, contact them. They might just write back. I've tried it sometimes. I've tried it with a famous Irish historian, Ruth Dudley Edwards, and it's worked. All right, toodaloo.